The crowd inside the sold-out arena was electric, buzzing with anticipation, their voices blending into a chaotic roar that pulsed through the air. The octagon stood at the center, a battleground where legends were made and warriors were broken. Tonight, the fight that had the entire combat sports world on edge was about to begin. Islam, a dominant force in mixed martial arts, versus Sharapudtin, an undefeated knockout artist with a reputation for finishing fights in brutal fashion. The stakes couldn't be higher, and as the fighters made their way to the cage, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Islam had spent years refining his craft, mastering the art of grappling with an intensity few could match. His training sessions were relentless, his mindset unshakable, and his control inside the cage unmatched. Every opponent who stepped across from him had been smothered, taken down, and neutralized with surgical precision. His style wasn't flashy, but it was effective and unstoppable force that drained the very will out of those who dared to challenge him. Many believed he was on his way to becoming one of the greatest to ever compete, and tonight was supposed to be just another step in cementing that legacy. But Sharapudtin was unlike anyone he had faced before. He wasn't just a striker, he was a destroyer. Every punch, every kick, every knee he threw carried the weight of a career-ending threat. Opponents didn't just lose to him, they barely walked away. His rise had been meteoric, cutting through the division with ruthless efficiency, leaving a trail of unconscious bodies in his wake. Some fighters hesitated, second-guessed themselves in the face of danger, but not him. He walked into fights like a man possessed, ready to unleash a storm that few could survive. As both fighters stepped into the cage, the atmosphere shifted. This wasn't just another fight. This was a collision of two unstoppable forces, each with something to prove. Islam needed to silence the doubters who claimed he hadn't faced a real knockout threat. Sharapudtin wanted to show the world that no one, not even the most dominant grappler in the sport, could hold him down. Fans were divided. Some believed Islam would smother him, drag him into deep waters, and drown him with relentless control. Others were convinced that all it would take was one shot, one mistake, and the fight would be over in an instant. The referee brought them to the center, their eyes locked in an intense stare down that sent chills through the crowd. There was no trash talk, no theatrics, just a silent promise of violence. The bell was seconds away from ringing, and the entire world was about to find out who would break first. Would Islam's technique and control be enough to weather the storm? Or would Sharaputtin's raw power be the one thing that could shatter the unshakable? The answer was coming, and no one could predict how it would unfold. The bell rang, and the arena erupted as both fighters took their first steps toward each other. Islam moved with calculated precision, his posture low, his focus sharp. He had spent months preparing for this moment, studying every movement Sharapudtin had ever made inside the cage. He knew the dangers, the explosive power, the unpredictable ferocity that could end a fight in the blink of an eye. But Islam wasn't here to play it safe. He was here to prove a point. Sharapudtin, on the other hand, carried an eerie stillness as he advanced. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. He had the look of a man who had already decided how this fight would end. His hands were relaxed, his stance wide, his breathing slow and measured. The world saw him as a reckless finisher, but those who truly understood his style knew there was method behind the destruction. He didn't just throw wild strikes. He set traps, waited for openings, and then unleashed hell with pinpoint accuracy. For the first few seconds, neither fighter made a move. The tension inside the cage was suffocating. The crowd, once deafening, had fallen into an anxious silence, waiting for that first moment of impact. Islam feinted, testing Sharaputtin's reactions, searching for a way in. But Sharaputtin didn't bite. He stood firm, unmoving, daring Islam to come closer. The first strike came unexpectedly, a lightning-fast inside leg kick from Islam, meant to disrupt Sharaputtin's base. It landed clean, a sharp smack echoing through the arena. But Sharaputtin didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked. A dangerous sign. He lifted his hands ever so slightly, adjusting his guard, eyes locked onto his opponent like a predator studying prey. Islam remained composed, knowing better than to be lured into a striking match. He had one goal: close the distance, take the fight to the mat, and drown Sharaputtin under his relentless pressure. But then, in a split second, Sharaputtin exploded forward. A jab, a simple, clean jab launched with terrifying speed, forcing Islam to retreat. It wasn't the power that made it dangerous. It was the timing. Sharaputtin was testing him, measuring his reactions, setting a pace that would force Islam to adapt. And in that moment, something shifted. This wasn't just a fight. It was a battle of strategy, of patience, of who would make the first crucial mistake. Outside the cage, the tension stretched far beyond the octagon. In Islam's corner, his coaches watched intently, analyzing every movement. They had trained him for this, drilled every possible scenario into his mind. They knew that one wrong step could spell disaster. On the other side, Sharaputtin's team stood with quiet confidence. They had seen it all before. Fighters who thought they could avoid the knockout. Fighters who thought they could wrestle their way to victory. They all had one thing in common: they never made it to the final bell. Back inside the cage, the chess match continued. Islam circled, searching for an opening, while Sharaputtin stalked him with an unsettling patience. Every strike was calculated, every movement part of a bigger plan. And then, just as Islam took a step forward, Sharaputtin struck a devastating right hook that missed by mere inches. The sheer force of it sent a gust of air across Islam's face, a chilling reminder of what was at stake. For a brief second, Islam hesitated. And in that hesitation, Sharaputtin pounced. A brutal combination left hook, right uppercut, body kick, all thrown with perfect precision. Islam managed to block most of it, but the impact sent shockwaves through his body. He needed to change the rhythm, break the momentum before it was too late. Then, in a flash, Islam shot for the takedown. It was fast, well-timed, and executed flawlessly. His arms wrapped around Sharaputtin's legs, and for the first time, the striker was off balance. The crowd roared, sensing the shift in control. But just as quickly as Islam had secured the takedown, Sharaputtin reacted. A powerful sprawl, a sudden burst of strength, and just like that, Islam found himself fighting for position. The struggle intensified as both fighters engaged in a brutal battle of will. Islam, known for his suffocating top control, worked to drag Sharaputtin to the mat, while Sharaputtin, with sheer force alone, fought to stay on his feet. It was a test of endurance, of raw power against relentless technique. The seconds felt like hours as the crowd watched in stunned silence. This was the moment that would define the fight. Would Islam impose his game plan, or would Sharaputtin find a way to break free? The answer was just a heartbeat away, but in a fight like this, a single heartbeat could change everything. Islam gritted his teeth, muscles straining as he tightened his grip around Sharaputtin's waist, driving forward with every ounce of strength in his body. For a brief moment, it seemed like he had broken through. Sharaputtin's balance shifted, his feet slipping ever so slightly. The crowd erupted, sensing the takedown was inevitable. But then, something happened that no one expected. Instead of fighting the takedown, Sharapudtin did the unthinkable. He leapt. A sudden, explosive burst of power sent his body twisting through the air, completely reversing the position. In one fluid motion, he wrapped his arm around Islam's head and used the momentum to roll, flipping them both over. Islam had gone from controlling the takedown to being caught in a front headlock in a fraction of a second. The arena went from deafening cheers to stunned silence. Islam reacted instantly, tucking his chin and pushing forward, trying to escape before Sharapudtin could tighten the grip. He had trained for this. He had drilled 1,000 ways to escape a guillotine choke. But this wasn't just any opponent. This was a man who turned every opening into a brutal finish. Sharaputtin's grip was like steel. His arms coiled around Islam's neck, flexing, squeezing. For the first time in the fight, Islam felt something foreign creeping into his mind: danger. His corner shouted instructions, voices urgent but controlled, reminding him to stay calm, to fight the hands, to shift his weight. He planted his feet, pushed off, and with sheer will managed to slip his head free just before the choke could fully tighten. A collective gasp echoed through the arena as Islam escaped and scrambled back to his feet. But the moment he stood, he realized he had walked straight into another trap. Sharapudtin was already moving, a step ahead, launching a spinning back elbow with terrifying precision. Islam barely had time to react. The strike grazed his temple, not landing flush, but enough to send his vision flashing white for a split second. His legs wobbled as he backed away, trying to regain control. Sharapudtin smelled blood. He surged forward, a storm of destruction in human form, his fists and knees flying in rapid succession. Islam covered up, absorbing shots, waiting for the storm to pass. He had been in tough positions before, but this was different. This wasn't just a striker trying to land a knockout. This was a hunter closing in, sensing his prey was wounded. But Islam wasn't done yet. Just as Sharapudtin wound up for another devastating hook, Islam dropped levels again. This time, there was no hesitation. His arms wrapped around Sharaputtin's legs, and with a powerful explosion of energy, he lifted him clean off the ground and slammed him into the mat with a thunderous impact. The crowd lost their minds. This was what Islam did best, dragging his opponents into deep waters where they couldn't breathe. Sharapudtin hit the canvas hard, and for the first time in his career, he looked human. His confidence, his composure, it all wavered as Islam immediately transitioned into top control. He locked his legs around Sharaputtin's body, his arms pressing down, suffocating, crushing. This was his world now. The storm had passed, and now it was time to drown Sharapudtin in his own exhaustion. But just as Islam adjusted his position, Sharapudtin did something no one saw coming. He started laughing. A low, breathless chuckle, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. His lips curled into a smirk, his eyes burning with something beyond defiance. Islam hesitated for just a fraction of a second, confused by the reaction. And in that single moment, Sharapudtin struck again. With a sudden, violent explosion of energy, he twisted his hips and rolled, bucking Islam off balance. It shouldn't have been possible. Islam had dominated stronger men, held down world-class fighters who had no way out. But Sharapudtin wasn't like the others. He didn't fight with logic. He fought with chaos. Before anyone could process what had happened, Sharapudtin had scrambled back to his feet. Islam followed, his instincts razor-sharp, but he wasn't fast enough. The moment he stood, Sharapudtin was already midair. A flying knee, perfectly timed, impossibly fast, came soaring toward Islam's chin. And then, just as it was about to land, the bell rang. The round was over. The impact never came. The fight wasn't finished yet. But as both fighters backed away, breathing heavy, bodies bruised and battered, one thing was clear: this war was far from over. As the bell rang, both fighters backed away, their chests heaving, their bodies bearing the evidence of war. The crowd was on its feet, the energy inside the arena unlike anything ever felt before. Islam stood with his hands on his hips, taking deep breaths, his mind racing. He had come close, so close to gaining full control. And yet, Sharapudtin was still standing, still dangerous, still smiling. It was unsettling, infuriating even. No matter how many times Islam dragged him down, no matter how much pressure he applied, Sharapudtin refused to break. Across the cage, Sharapudtin wiped the sweat and blood from his face, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the previous round like it was nothing. But there was something different in his eyes now, a flicker of something new. Respect. He had hurt Islam, pushed him to the edge, but he hadn't put him away. And that realization changed something in him. The final round was seconds away from beginning, and both corners gave their last words of advice. Islam's team told him to stay disciplined, to stick to the game plan, to avoid getting sucked into a brawl. He had to be smart, had to control the pace. On the other side, Sharaputtin's corner urged him to let loose, to stop hesitating, to finish what he started. Both men knew that this was it. 1 round. 5 minutes. No more second chances. The referee signaled, and the last round began. This time, there was no hesitation. Islam shot forward, closing the distance instantly. He wasn't going to give Sharaputtin another second of space. A flurry of punches, a level change, and just like that, Islam was in on the takedown again. But Sharaputtin knew it was coming. He sprawled, stuffing the attempt, but Islam refused to let go. He drove forward with relentless force, dragging Sharaputtin toward the fence, pressing him against it, his hands locked around his opponent's body. For the first time, Sharaputtin grunted in frustration. He tried to break free, but Islam adjusted, shifting his weight, sweeping his leg out from under him. The crowd gasped as Sharaputtin hit the mat, and Islam wasted no time securing top position. This was where he was supposed to win. This was his domain. But then, the unexpected happened. Sharaputtin, trapped beneath Islam's crushing weight, did something reckless, something no one could have predicted. Instead of defending, instead of fighting the position, he started throwing elbows from the bottom. Vicious, slicing elbows aimed at Islam's temple. The strikes weren't meant to escape. They were meant to hurt. Islam flinched as one of the elbows connected clean, a sharp burst of pain shooting through his skull. For just a split second, his grip loosened. That was all Sharaputtin needed. With an explosive bridge, he twisted, bucking Islam off balance, creating just enough space to scramble back to his feet. The crowd erupted in disbelief. No one had ever escaped Islam's control like that. No one had ever fought their way out of that deep water. Now standing, both fighters stared at each other, exhausted but unwilling to give in. They had thrown everything at one another, and yet here they were, still standing. Blood trickled from cuts on both their faces, their bodies covered in sweat and bruises. The final minute had arrived. This was it. Then, without warning, Sharaputtin charged. A wild, reckless blitz, punches, knees, elbows, everything he had left, thrown with abandon. Islam ducked, weaved, evaded, but some shots landed, forcing him backward. He had to stop this before it was too late. Then, in one perfect counter, he stepped in, grabbed Sharaputtin's leg in mid-kick, and with a powerful sweep, slammed him to the ground one last time. But before Islam could secure control, Sharaputtin did something insane. Instead of trying to get up, he locked his arms around Islam's head, pulling him into a tight guillotine choke. The arena went silent. Islam's arms flailed for a moment, his body stiffening. Was this it? Was this how it ended? Then, in a display of sheer grit, Islam twisted his body, forcing himself out of the choke. With one last surge of effort, he maneuvered into full mount, pinning Sharaputtin down. 10 seconds left. Islam raised his fists and rained down strikes. Punch after punch, hammer fists, elbows. Sharaputtin covered up, trying to survive, but Islam's fists were relentless. The referee hovered close, ready to stop it. Then the horn sounded. The fight was over. Both fighters collapsed onto the mat, completely drained. The crowd roared, shaking the very foundation of the arena. No one knew who had won. It had been chaos, a war of wills, a battle that felt too close to call. The announcer stepped into the cage, the judge's decision in his hands. The tension was unbearable as both fighters stood, arms draped over their coaches for support. Then, after a long pause, the decision was read. A split decision. And the winner was Islam. The crowd erupted, some in cheers, some in shock. Islam lifted his hands, exhausted but victorious. Sharaputtin, breathing heavily, nodded in respect. No anger, no protest, just understanding. They had pushed each other to the absolute limit, and in the end, one had simply edged out the other. As they met in the center of the cage, they embraced, exchanging words only they could hear. A rivalry had been born, but more than that, a new chapter in fighting history had been written. One thing was certain: this wasn't the last time they would meet. And next time, neither man would leave anything to chance.